So let's learn how to animate this scene. In order to create this animation, we need to convert this text layer into a shape layer. Similar to how we convert a text layer to an outlined layer, using Create Outlines in Illustrator. After this action, we get a shape with a path that we can move and modify. After that, we will use an effect called Trim Path and animate one of its parameters. If you're wondering why we can't simply use the Trim Path effect now, it's because if we don't convert the text to a path, we won't be able to achieve that. Even if we activate the stroke for this text layer and try to add the trim path, we will see that this effect doesn't appear here. Okay, I'll bring all back to normal. So, in order to convert this text layer into a shape layer with a path, right-click on it, go to Create, and choose Create Shapes from Text. The text layer will be automatically turned off. We don't need it for now, so we can enable the Shy function to it. Now let's go to the fill of this shape and turn it off. Then go to Stroke and choose the dark color from the palette. Now change the thickness to 1. Let's click here to see how it looks. Great, now let's zoom in a bit, either by using the scroll wheel or by pressing these keys. I see that it's too thin. Let's set the stroke to 2 and press Enter. Now let's duplicate this layer using Ctrl D, then place this layer below the first one. This will be the layer that will be colored after the stroke animation is finished. Because after the stroke is drawn, we want to reveal the entire word. So let's activate the fill on this layer, choose the dark color, and this time, turn off the stroke. So now, we have one layer with the text filled with color, and an additional layer with only the stroke. For now, let's turn off the layer with the fill and focus on the animation of the text layer with the stroke. To do that, let's open this layer, select the contents, go to Add, and choose the Trim Paths effect. Now, let's open the effect and expand this panel for convenience. And now, if I move the parameter called End, you'll see that the stroke disappears and reappears. This is the parameter we're going to animate. And we will do it by creating keyframes. What are keyframes? Keyframes are a fundamental concept in animation and motion graphics. In After Effects, keyframes are used to define the starting and ending points of an animation or transition. They are points in time that mark the position, size, rotation, opacity, and other properties of an element or layer. Keyframes are also used to control the speed and timing of an animation. By adjusting the distance between keyframes, you can control the speed of an animation. By adjusting the timing of keyframes, you can control the spacing and rhythm of an animation. Okay, so first things first, before animating the parameter, let's make sure the time indicator is at the beginning of the timeline. Now let's decide so that at this time point, at the 0 second, the value of this parameter will be 0. And in order to give the command to After Effects, we need to create a keyframe. To create keyframes, click on the stopwatch icon for this parameter. And there, you created your first keyframe. Now let's move to the second number 2, and decide so that at this time point, the value of this parameter will be 100. Once we create the first keyframe for a specific parameter, and then change its value along the timeline, additional keyframes with the new value will be automatically created for us. Therefore, we see the second keyframe created without clicking the stopwatch icon. And in order to see what we have achieved, let's place the time indicator at the beginning of our timeline and press the spacebar. Great job, you have created your first animation. Now let's place the time indicator here and see how we can make this animation a bit more interesting. We can do this by creating keyframes for an additional parameter called offset. As you can see, as soon as I move it, the line starts to move. I'll set it back to 0, and let's animate it together. So first, let's go to the beginning of the animation and set it up so that, at this time, the value of this parameter will be 0. And at the second number 2, we'll set it up so that this parameter will make a full rotation. Let's see how it looks. And now, while the line is being drawn, it also moves. Next, we will make our animation a bit more interesting by transforming our regular keyframes into easy ease keyframes. What are easy ease keyframes? Easy ease is a type of keyframe interpolation that helps you achieve smooth and natural-looking motion. When you apply easy ease to a keyframe, it adds gradual acceleration and deceleration to the animation, making it appear more natural. To convert these keyframes to easy ease keyframes, we will select them and press the F9 key. Mac users, hold down the Fn key while pressing F9. Let's do that and see how it looks now. Looks nice. Let's close all the layer parameters and move on. Now let's find the right moment in the timeline, where the filled text layer should enter the scene. Let's say we want it to start entering the scene slightly before all the strokes are drawn. To see where the animation of the stroke ends, we can select this layer and press the U key. This way, we can see all the keyframes that exist on this layer. Now let's place the time indicator here, and decide that this layer will enter the frame from this point forward. So let's turn back on this layer, and the parameter we will create keyframes for this time will be the opacity parameter. To quickly access this parameter, we can simply select the layer and press the T key. So at this point in time, the value of this parameter should be 0. To give After Effects the command, we'll click on the stopwatch icon for this parameter and create the keyframes with this value. And at the second number 2 and 15 frames, which is exactly 1 second after the first keyframes, we'll change the value to 100. And we'll also convert these keyframes into easy ease keyframes. Question: what is the shortcut to convert a linear keyframe into an easy ease keyframe? We'll do it by selecting the keyframe and pressing the F9 key. Let's see how it looks. Great job. Okay, so we've animated the layers, and now I want to teach you something very important. Let's say later in the video, we'll need to move this animation to the side. If I move this layer, the fill layer won't move with it. Then I'll have to move it as well. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo the action. To make both layers move together, we can link the bottom layer to the top layer using the parent and link function found here. Parenting and linking are both powerful tools in After Effects that allow you to control the motion of one layer or property based on the motion of another. Parenting is a relationship between two layers in which one layer, the child, is attached to and follows the motion of another layer, the parent. When you parent a layer to another layer, any motion or transformation applied to the parent layer is also applied to the child layer. This is useful for creating complex animations, such as characters or vehicles, where the movement of one part affects the movement of another. Linking, on the other hand, is a more flexible relationship that allows you to control one property or parameter of a layer based on another. In our case, we need to parent one layer to another. To do that, we'll drag the pick whip of this layer into this layer. Now, every time I move the top layer, the bottom layer will move with it. Alright. I'll press Ctrl Z. And now, it's time to move on and start to animate this text layer. But before that, let's turn off these two layers so they don't get in our way, and proceed. And now let's talk about the two main methods to animate this text layer to achieve the result we see in the example. The first involves separating each letter and animating them individually, which is a manual process. The second and more efficient method is to use text animators in After Effects. Let me show you the manual method first real quick. So, first of all, I need to duplicate this layer as many times as the number of letters in this word. Then, I need to leave one letter from the word on each layer. Next, I have to arrange their position and animate them one by one, and create the timing between them manually. As you can see, it is a very long and cumbersome way. I hope you got my point. I did a lot of actions for such a simple animation. Therefore, we won't do it this way. We'll do it in a much smarter and faster way, using the text animators. So first, let's open the layer. We can close that, and enlarge this panel a bit. Now, we just have to select the text and open up the Animate list. From here, we need to choose which property will be in our first animator. In our case, since we want the text to move from one place to another, we'll choose the position property for our first animator. And here we can see that an animator has been created. The first thing we need to do is set the range selector of this animator. This means that now we will decide where we want the text to be at the end or at the beginning of this animator. Let's set to be here below for now. We can change it later at any time. For now, we're just trying to see what works best for us. Let's bring it down a bit. And let's bring the text even further down. Let's write 120. So now, we've set a certain position for the text. Let's scale down the preview screen and enlarge this panel. Now we need to open the range selector and also open the advanced properties. So now, we will control the text based on the value we set in the range selector. And we will do it by changing the offset parameter. This means, when the offset is set to 0, it means that the text will be located at the value we set to the range selector. And if we set the offset to 100, the text will be located at its original position, which is where it was before we set the value in the range selector. But if I move this value all the way down to -100, the text will end up in its original position, and that's not what we're going for. To fix it, we need to change how this animator functions, and we can do that by changing the shape of this animator to ramp up. Now, when the offset is set to -100, the text position is based on the value we set to the range selector. And when the offset is set to 100, the text returns to its original position. And now, we can set keyframes to the offset property to create the animation we want. So let's make sure we are at the beginning of the timeline and create a keyframe with the value of -100. Now let's move to second number 1 and change the offset to 100. While working with text animators, we can change the easing of the keyframes here, instead of using the F9 shortcut. Set it to 85 by 85 and see how that looks. Don't worry if you feel a bit confused. We will do this many times in the course, so eventually, you will understand it much better. Alright, and now, let's move on and learn how to make the text invisible when it's at the bottom. I want it to be visible only when it reaches its original position up here. To do this, we need to find a point in time where the text has already finished its animation and is in its final position. Now right-click on it, go to Mask, and create a new mask. Now, when the text is at the bottom, we won't see it. If after creating the mask, you still see the text, you can change its location without messing up the animation, simply by changing the value for the range selector. Adjust the range selector and check your animation. Looks nice. Alright, moving on. Now let's bring back the 2 layers. And now, I want this animation to start only after this text is finished its animation. Let's say at this time point, in the second number 1 and 15 frames. Let's move it while holding the Shift key so that the layer aligns with the time indicator's position. And let's see how it looks. Looks good. Once we finish the animation for this section, we can apply our chosen pink color from the color palette to the text. So select this layer, go to the Character tab, and use the eyedropper to pick the pink color from the palette. Let's also turn off the background of the preview screen and move on. Now, let's animate the rest of the layers. This text will go up, and this text go down. First, let's find the point in time where we want to start animating the layers. Let's see where the animation ends, that is, where the last keyframes are. To display all the keyframes we have in the scene, make sure you don't select any layer and press the U key. And here, I see that the keyframes are located here, meaning the animation of these layers is finished here. Now we will select this layer and that layer, but not this one. Why not this one? Because we connected this layer to that layer, which means that when we move this layer, the second layer will move along with it. So, because of that, let's select both of these layers and open the position parameter for both of them. For that, we press the P key. Now we'll create keyframes with the current value, because, at this point in time, we want the text to remain here. But in a second, number 4, this layer will go here above. We will move it while holding the Shift key. And we will move this layer downward, also while holding the Shift key. Now let's select the keyframes we created and press F9 to convert them to Easy Ease keyframes. It looks a bit boring. To make the motion more interesting, we can change the behavior of this animation. We will do this using the graph editor. Right-click and make sure you are using the speed graph editor. Now let's select both of these keyframes and drag the handle here. Let's also select both of these keyframes and move the handle here. Let's see how it looks. Now the text starts moving slowly at first, then it gains a lot of speed. And finally it slows down towards the end. Note that the duration of the animation hasn't changed. We just changed the velocity of the keyframes, and not the duration of the animation. Now let's go back to our timeline and learn how to change the velocity without entering the graph editor and adjusting the handles manually. For this, we do need to select all the keyframes. Hold down the Alt key and double-click on one of the keyframes. This will bring up the keyframe velocity panel. Let's enter 85 for both and press OK. Let's see how it looks. It looks good. Alright, so the first scene is ready, and we can now proceed to the next one, where we create a 3D text animation.